Gendun Chophel was perhaps the most colorful, controversial, and compelling Tibetan intellectual figure of the early 20th century. He was a brilliant thinker and writer and a complex personality whose sojourns in India and Sri Lanka, study of South Asian and Western languages and culture, embrace of progressive political and social ideas, and imprisonment and eventual death upon his return to Tibet have served, in the decades since his death, to elevate him in the eyes of many to the status of cultural hero. He has become emblematic of both the promise and peril of Tibet's encounter with modernity, which he was among the first from his nation to experience and articulate. Gendun Chöphel was born in Amdo in the Tibetan northeast to a family steeped in the practices of the old, or Nyingma, tradition of Tibetan Buddhism. He learned much about literature, art, and religion from his father, an accomplished scholar and expert in the great perfection Dzogchen teachings. After his father's death, his quest for further education led him to a series of monasteries affiliated with the dominant Gelugpa school, culminating in his joining the great monastic University of Rebkong in Lhasa in 1927. Everywhere he went, Gendun Chöphel distinguished himself by his wide array of talents and interests, which included painting, literary analysis, poetic composition, and above all the philosophical debates that were central to Gelugpa monastic education. He also gained notoriety as an iconoclast who challenged the interpretations found in the standard textbooks, and in debate could and would argue for any position, including those deemed extremist. Branded a sophist, distrusted by many classmates, and frequently in conflict with his teachers, he left Rebkong and monastic life forever in 1934 when invited to accompany the Indian pundit Rahul Sankrityayan to southern Tibet to search for Sanskrit manuscripts. At the end of the expedition, Gendun Chöphel returned with Sankrityayan to India. He spent most of the next 12 years traveling the subcontinent, visiting Buddhist holy sites and modern cities, as well as living for a year in Sri Lanka and spending considerable time in the hill station of Kalimpong, a center for Western, Tibetan interchange and the fermentation of Tibetan modernism. He met sadhus and scholars, learned firsthand about women and wine, and produced an array of writings that included a lengthy account of his travels. He translated Sanskrit classics like Shakuntala and the Ramayana into Tibetan, wrote a pilgrim's guidebook to South Asia as well as scores of poems in Tibetan and at least 4 in English. His History of Early Tibet, White Annals, was derived in part from texts that had been recently discovered in the Dunhuang caves in China. He also compiled a manual of the erotic arts that was written in verse and drawn from Indian treatises and personal experience. He returned to Tibet in 1946 and gathered around him a small circle of disciples with whom he discussed politics and culture, and to whom he lectured on various topics, including Madhyamaka philosophy. His posthumously published interpretation of the latter would scandalize the religious establishment with its attack on the Gelugpa way of explaining emptiness and the two truths. Not long after he returned, he was imprisoned on trumped-up charges. The real reasons for his incarceration are uncertain, but his critical attitude toward Tibetan political and religious institutions may have been a factor. He emerged from prison in 1949 and died in 1951, probably from cirrhosis of the liver. Though he wrote little in his final years, he did continue to compose poetry, the one thing that had given him pleasure throughout his life. Whatever their views on his political or philosophical opinions, most educated Tibetans agree that Gendun Chöphel was a superb poet, perhaps their greatest of the 20th century. He was deeply learned in both Sanskrit and Tibetan literature, had mastered a full range of Tibetan poetic forms, and could with equal effectiveness express religious piety, philosophical subtlety, or emotions such as joy, wonderment, outrage, loneliness, bitterness, and despondency. In preparing In the Forest of Faded Wisdom, the prolific scholar and author Donald Lopez has brought together virtually every poem by Gendun Chöphel known to exist, apart from poems he translated from Sanskrit and most of his manual of erotics. The book includes a concise and highly informative introduction, facing-page versions of the original Tibetan poems and Lopez's careful and often eloquent English translations of them, Gendun Chöphel's handful of Victorian-style poems in English, a useful, if insufficiently informative, set of endnotes, and an index of first lines. Gendun Chophel never collected his own verse, which is found scattered in a multitude of sources, many of them undated, so a chronological presentation of the poems is nearly impossible. Lopez therefore arranges them in 6 thematic sections: teachings of a master without disciples, laments of an unknown sage, the ways of the world, songs of the Tibetan kings, precepts on passion, and English compositions. These titles convey the range of topics Gendun Chophel addressed in his poetry, which include traditional Buddhist sutra and tantra teachings, his long-standing sense of persecution and isolation, the vanity and ignorance of people everywhere, whether lay or monastic, Tibetan, Indian, or Western, the greatness of Tibet in its early era, and the joys and snares of sexual love. Some of these are themes found in Tibetan verse from any era, and many of Gendun Chophel's poems could as easily have been composed in 1640 as 1940. At the same time, though, his first-hand knowledge of India and its culture, his acquaintance with Western scientific and political ideas, and his pessimism in the face of his own and the world's limitations set him off as decidedly modern relative to other Tibetans of his era, though he himself, as Lopez suggests, must have felt as if he inhabited an in-between state, a bardo, neither traditional nor modern, monk nor layman, Tibetan nor outsider. Thank you for watching Wow Me Say.